remembering to record. Thanks for those who are joining. I know there are quite a few people joining from all around the world, and I know those in South Africa. Hello. I am really happy to be here. It's good to see. It's good to see what Sarah has built here at the as an artist book hub. And I'm going to talk a bit to two of my books. And I'm going to introduce my practice as a maker of books, as someone who came from a practice of object making and installation, and came to the book form in very much a writerly way, as opposed to an object-based way, and as opposed to a printmaking way, which is where many of those in the community here and online are very much based in and schooled in. So my route into the books was through novels and fictions, and trying to fit in, trying to inhabit space. So just a bit about how I got here and how I got to these kinds of objects, and I'm going to try to talk you through. My early career was marked by working in the public space through an interventionist practice, so a lot of putting objects and throwing things out into the public sphere and into the everyday. And I came to the artist book form as a different kind of publicness, something that could be mass-produced and something that was portable and double-sided, that didn't necessarily need an exhibition to be interacted with. Although, you know, those of us who are artists, we love an exhibition, and we love a way of expanding those things that we make and those things that we write. What's always interested me about the book form is that mix of not only public and private space, but very much what kind of interaction it demands. So it takes away that sense of that kind of cool, rational contemplation, and brings a bit more of the sensory into the realm of the exhibition. So most of my ideas around book art and getting large research projects that are quite unwieldy and sprawling into a book form developed traveling a lot. Being in Northern Europe, I lived in Brussels for quite a few years, and inhabiting an in-between space, often trying to get a take on places through novels and fiction. So I came into books through storytelling, and kind of inhabiting book forms in a writerly way. So I would rewrite texts. So key texts that I thought were very like overly influential and had colonial overtones. I rewrote the story and I tweaked it. So generally, I prefer to work with published book formats, in the sense that I like to work with publishers, and I like to work with people who make books, not necessarily from an art making practice. I like big editions for book art. I make big editions. Like, I prefer to make enough books so that I can give them away, and I've handed, and I like handing them out, especially if that lends itself to the concept. So I still make objects, and I still work as an academic, as an academic writer. That's something I came to actually much more recently. But I'm generally in the business of books on every level, and I get very touchy about when the object of the book isn't respected that much, and when I don't have control over what font is being used or what is being done with my images, which is a bit of an occupational hazard at this point in my life and career. what you keep seeing on the screen is 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. It was quite a big work. It was the result of living in Brussels and trying to get a handle on Art Nouveau. So Art Nouveau in Brussels is meant to be like the kind of epitome of the city, the tourist city. It's called Art Nouveau City, and it has quite a sci-fi aesthetic because it was trying to imagine the future. And the idea was that, well, there we go. And trying to very much trying to kind of imagine a future from the late 19th century, early 20th century. Here in the UK, everyone knows William Morris made his own paper and made his own books. Tried to also, make sure the architecture fitted in to the essential style and of a whole way of living that was encapsulated in the book. And I take that into my own practice from a bookness way of thinking. But I also find that quite seductive and quite beguiling in ways that are politically highly suspicious. So what I found in Brussels was not only kind of complete fascination with the Art Nouveau style and this idea of the total artwork taking over a whole environment, but also that it was entirely funded with money from the Congo and literally built with the stuff, with the wood and this mass extraction of materials. And that put a different spin on how I understood the total artwork. And I mean, the Gesamtkunstwerk, I'm sorry for mispronouncing that horribly, it takes on a very sinister form when looked at too closely. So I became quite obsessed with the start of early modernism and what ornamentation means when a colony in Africa, as something quite dismembered and pushed far away, becomes a kind of ornament in the kind of the body of the metropole of the colonial body. And that's where I started, and I was working as an artist, and I was sitting in Belgium and talking about Africa a lot. And I got to 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, which is, I'm sure everyone here knows what it is. It's a Jules Verne novel about underwater travel. And it's really popular with children. It's about journey. It's about captain that makes some sort of fantastical submarine that traverses the under ocean. And I used it as a kind of house for Art Nouveau, and I used it to kind of poke at and explore the colonial underpinnings of Art Nouveau and its relationship to an exotic idea of Africa and something that could just be traversed. And what I really became interested with as the more I read about Jules Verne, and when I rewrote the whole novel, like a good modernist, I found that books in 1870, when the first Jules Verne novels were being published, were important were sold for the object of the book. So there wasn't this idea of copyright yet. There was simply an idea that the book could be translated into any language. And it wasn't the content of the book that was important. What was for sale and what got sold and what made Jules Verne a really rich man were the objects of the book being sold. And I also found out that in the translation, the story changed a lot. And who the bad guys were and who the good guys were also depended on who was doing the translation, which I thought was kind of a brilliant and open opportunity to make a post-colonial reading of that Jules Verne novel, kind of the adventure novel, and to take on the watery, sea-filled forms that Jules Verne uses. So I also found a lot of Verne's writing quite decorative. So the pictures you see here are what I mean. I call them pictures. They're bits of the text that just describe the sea and the ocean and the waves and the tides. And I thought they were decorative, so I made them into decorative ornamental pieces. And they sort of interrupt the text, trying to make the reader aware that it is a book they're reading. So it's really quite a difficult book to actually read. That's the point. And like to physically read, you can get it online as well, should you wish to. But it also makes quite an interesting sculpture, or quite a pleasing sculpture, just to have something to show in the exhibition, to have something for people to look at. Because they're not going to all stand around in the exhibition space and read the book. I want them to take it home and do that. And I want my stuff to be significantly accessible in that respect. And that's when I embrace books very much. So this shows really literally how I try and shift texts, how the form of writing is part of the aesthetic. But I don't just mean I make the words curl, or I put gaps in them, or I move them around. I write by adopting different styles. And I write in a way that has a particular aesthetic that I'm trying to maybe not copy, but inhabit. And I still do really take on this idea of the whole object and kind of microcosm existing in a kernel of a kind of organic idea. And I really believe very strongly that the words we use matter, and how we tell stories matter. And I always feel like I'm really willing to sink time into that. I'm quoting Donna Haraway there, words and matter. But being an artist and coming from objects and still being very much immersed in objects, not just their surface aesthetics, I also take on the idea that matter matters. So that's also kind of idea of Karen Barad, which I think some of the early modernist stuff, as exclusionary as it was, and as much as there were an enormous amount of hierarchies embedded in those early modernist idea, I think they were getting towards trying to understand like the very cells of matter, with some of that turn of the century work happening at the same time as colonialism. So that was kind of really an artist's way of inhabiting an intellectual idea. I then found myself back there back in South Africa, where I'm from, and in the city of Johannesburg, where I wasn't from, like a real much more large and very, very complicated city, much more complicated than my town of Cape Town. And I started trying to understand spaces less through their books, and much more through how space was used. and much more through how the African city imagines space. So from investigating Art Nouveau, dealing with this kind of environment that led to this kind of book, I moved into the African city. These are actually images of an Art Nouveau building that is a very long story in Banza in the Congo, in the Belgian Congo. And I started to try and read the subject matter. I was looking at much more in terms of what the African city was posing it to be, with a kind of reuse, with a necessity and with an urgency, and with a very different way of treating nature. As something that was an important, much more important leading way of understanding and theorizing using space. So this became a kind of trying to understand things and objects that were designed to be ordered, to be working, no longer working, but still being used in different ways. So working spatially and also investigating archives and colonial records, I also moved much more squarely into academia and theory, because I really wanted to understand and pick apart what it was I was making and trying to convey. So the deeper into academia and theory I went, the more books became disembodied again. And they started to be inside the computer and not objects at all. And books and images were being abused horribly and being used in an illustrative way. And I started reading to fragment, to pick out choice facts, to argue with the colonial labels that were attached to images, and get angry at the hierarchical frames that rendered certain human bodies as objects, and modernist objects, and more important than any others, because they were attached to an idea of a system that was always going to be in place, that in places like Kinshasa, in places like Johannesburg, they are not in place. So what you get is a lot of fragments. And those fragments are by no means dysfunctional. They are working very well. So they're working very well within their own logic. They're not doing what their designers wanted them to do. So I became really interested in how things disintegrate rather than only how they are built. I started driving architectural historians mad by not going straight to the architectural plans as the only guide through which to navigate, because I felt like the buildings themselves are also a kind of archive. Also, in a lot of archive in the African city, there are simply no records available. And I find that an interesting space, and a space that can still be interpreted and read in less linear ways. And I think there's space within that. So the book that's on the screen now is Congo Style, From Belgian Art Nouveau to African Independence. And it is not my aesthetic by any stretch of the imagination. But more my aesthetic is the book behind it, which was an exhibition, a big group exhibition about Art Nouveau in Brussels last year. And that's just the catalog for it. I wasn't responsible for that show, but I participated, and I was part of kind of the talks in the beginning, and I did put on objects. Some of my sculptural objects were part of that exhibition, but I put it here in a conversation about books and booking, as a way of also just comparing what it's like to come in from an art world, from an object making practice, into academia, where there's this remove from the object. And yet we're talking about materiality. We're talking about objects a lot and all the time. And we're investigating them and just kind of trying to find out what they can tell us. And sometimes what they can tell us is how we experience them. We need to actually go there. We can't just write. So Congo Style, my book, that's my first academic book. I think is a kind of artist book, and I may get taken to task for that later. But just by virtue of the fact that I wrote it, it is a kind of artist book, but also it's how I write. So I approach academic writing in the same way that, in the only way I know how to approach writing, which is sure to inhabit a style and get it right and be able to use that as a kind of tool. So, and yes, my students who are online are aware of how much I do emphasize that. However, I think it's also how I write in terms of how I understand objects is a way of understanding through the experiential, and a way of understanding not just an artwork on its own as if it's something disembodied. If you come from art, you look at the context when you look at the exhibition, and you can't just look at things on their own. So that's very much what happens in Congo Style. And that is kind of an official book. And it's considered something that's really important for academics to do. And it was really important for me. And now I know how I want to inhabit the academic space, kind of playing through Congo Style. But the whole time I made this official book, I kept dwelling on occurrences between the main sites of study. I kept thinking about kind of the anecdotes, the bits in between the research that really held me and held my imagination for much longer. So things like bridge stairs that were unfinished on the side of the road, that never had a bridge across them, that got used in, I thought, really interesting ways. And used also by plant life, by insect life. Tourist postcards that I found once in a market in Paris, written from a colonial exhibition with, pictures that are astounding in their arrogance today to us, more than 100 years later. But what I really got struck by was the little notes of families writing to their friends and loved ones as tourists, as people who went to a colonial exhibition and discovered there are other places in the world. And really disturbing, actually, objects and situations that are memories of violence, that are sites of extreme violence, and often in the most callous ways. But they're still remaining, they're still moldering, they're still becoming something else, always in a process of always already growing into a kind of another life. And I find failed buildings, strange moments, strange material moments that are considered often dirty, often ruins, as a place of great liveliness, and not necessarily in a positive, hopeful way at all. I'm really interested in the plants that grow, the kinds of weeds that grow. I often get really sidetracked trying to understand what the plants do and what work the plants can do for humans, like literally providing food, like a lot of weeds can provide food, but also what they tell about the content of the soil by what color they are. whole lot of images, a whole lot of scenarios kind of fell out of my official book, out of Congo Style. And I think perhaps Congo Style can't actually be a whole book for me unless it's kind of read in relation to the remaindering, which is a book of all the bits that kind of fell out of the main book, or they kind of feature in the main book, but they don't fit together that well in a way that it gives them the kind of life I wanted to. So the remaindering is kind of a choppy bit of a book, like my serious artist books. It makes quite a cool sculpture when you put them all together. So people can be happy in the exhibition space if they have to. I think I have 5 minutes left. I have 2 minutes left. Okay, so I'm gonna read the first paragraph, and I can encourage those that the students that are here to come see the book Objects. I believe this student's being kept in the next room. And yeah, those who are online, by all means, it's easy to find the remaindering online, and I do like distributing them, so you can always contact me if you want to receive a proper copy. Yeah, the words do things, but the images do things as well, and there's a kind of a really strict set of rules with which I make drawings in the remaindering that deals with fragments, bits of plans, bits of materials, lettering, that for me created whole ecosystems. And I will read the first few lines. Remainders are stubborn, sticky objects. They are ambiguous. They emerge when the historic gestures that gave birth to them go awry. From never finished infrastructural features and unmade architectural plans to partially dilapidated public monuments, they still function, although not in the way their makers intended. Despite existing in a constant state of disobeying their human designers, these remainders also hold something of their origins. Over the years and pounding of weather, the changing patterns of movement around remainders of humans, insects, animals, and plants affect their appearance and form. Humans built them and may still use them in some way, but their allegiances are with their environments.